So you clicked on the video because you want to learn about Rook endgames. Smart choice, because Rook endgames are also the most common type of endgame in chess. And today I'm going to be arming you guys with the 10 most important ideas or positions, at least in my opinion, which if you want to be able to play Rook endgames proficiently, you should probably know. But with that being said, let's get into the first idea for the video. And the first sort of set of positions that we need to understand when it comes to Rook endgames is not necessarily strictly a Rook endgame in the sense that both sides have rooks. Rather, we're going to be looking at is the positions where one side has a rook and the other just has a pawn. And basically, because in this position black's pawn is pushing this way, ideally black would just like to have their king somewhere like planted in this square, for example, stop the pawn from advancing, then use a rook to sweep up the pawn as well, and then go home, shake hands, and hopefully have a good night's sleep. But of course, matters are not so simple when the king is hiding in the corner on a8, very far away from ultimately where the pawn wants to go, which is the promotion square f1. And in order to really figure out what the evaluation of this position is, which is ultimately going to be either white is winning or the position is going to be a draw in the worst case scenario where white just simply has to give the rook up to the pawn, we are going to need to do some calculation to really figure all the details out. And I know when I say calculation, that's going to scare some people off, but this sort of position generally is very simple in its sort of nature when it comes to the calculation of things. And first of all, in our calculations, what we're going to understand is that when black is trying to promote this pawn, they're also going to need to throw some king moves in there. If they just simply try to advance the pawn forward, let's say we move our king in further, and they just keep pushing their pawn, well, if they push their pawn far enough without any king moves, eventually the distance is going to become so far between them that we can just attack the pawn and, well, it's just going to lose itself, right? Which is why, coming back to this position, we need to mentally think about, like, okay, so to get to the f1 square, they're going to need 1, 2, 3 pawn moves, and then probably 1, 2, 3, 4 king moves, which is 7 moves in total. And given that it is white to move in this position, we're going to, okay, probably need 1 rook move to cover the promotion square, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 king moves to also cover that promotion square f1. So we can see that both sides need 7 moves to ultimately reach that control of the f1 square, but given that it is white to move in this position, we can comfortably assert that white should be winning, and if we put some moves on the board, we're going to see that we won't even actually have to reach all the way down to e2 and g2 or whatever, because our king is already making contact with this pawn. That means when black pushes f3 now, we can just simply play rook f8, and there is simply just no way that black can make further progress. We're going to be racking off the pawn very soon. Assuming you know how to mate with king and rook, this should be an easy win. However, if we just modify the position even so slightly now that it is black to move and also that the king is on f6 instead of the g6 square, the evaluation radically changes such that now there's no longer white who is winning, but rather just simply a draw. And we see this as if we go down a similar path here. White tries to bring in their king. Well, it just simply doesn't quite work the same, because our king sort of does what we'd call shouldering, in the sense that it blocks the path off that white would like to take to sort of attack the pawn, compared to if our king was on the other side of the pawn on g4, where it would not be obstructing white from doing so. And that just makes this whole position a fairly easy draw. We just bring our king in, white does the same, but we're just too quick in this case. We're going to be going to f1 queen next. White can give a check, and we have to be slightly careful in this position. There are 2 drawing moves. Either we go to f3, or we can also go to d1 actually. Both are holding. They're going to have to bring their rook back to stop us, and this is going to be a pretty easy draw. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to go to f1, because then now after king d2, king g2, they give a check. Well, if we go back to this square now and the rook f8, well, now king g2, king e2, and they now have control over the promotion square. This is very bad news for black. Another incredibly important concept when it comes to rook endgames is what we'd call cutting off the king. And we can see it in this position that looks awfully similar to the ones we just looked at, except instead of there being a pawn on f5, the pawn is on h5. Obviously, if the pawn being even further away from our king now, which was already sort of buried in the corner, it's going to be very difficult for our king and rook to really coordinate such that they are able to go and stop this pawn in a very brute force way. In fact, the position is drawn, except if white plays this one move, which involves this method of cutting off the king, which is playing rook b5. And this only works because the king is on the 3rd rank. If the king were even just on the 4th rank, we wouldn't be able to cut the king off. Like, let's say we insert one move like king a7, king g5 rather. If we go rook b4, this just doesn't quite work the same. Where we can see the following down this line, right, like king c5, they push the pawn, only move is rook b1, but now king g4 and they're going to be just in time to make the draw. But again, that's why in this position, we cut the king off when it's still on the third rank, such that now it really cannot get involved at all in helping the pawn promote. And if they try to just push their pawn full speed ahead, it doesn't exactly work, because by the time they get to h3 in this variation, we're going to go rook b3. And remember, if their king was already on the 4th rank or 5th rank, whatever, then they would be able to play king g4, protect the pawn, all would be fine. But in this position, that's not the case, which means that now if they go h2, we can play rook h3 now, we grab up the pawn, there's no way they can really save it, which really illustrates the power of cutting off the king, because, like, I mean, what are they going to do if they can't push the pawn? Wait, like, because then we're going to bring our king in, and we're just going to scoop the pawn up eventually in a very simple manner like that. But cutting the king off is not just exclusive to, say, rook versus pawn endgames. It's also possible in rook and pawn versus rook endgames, for example, where, like, say in this position, if we were to just play a natural move, like playing according to endgame principles, where we just bring the king in, that's what you're supposed to do in endgames, right? Well, in this position, that would allow black to sort of bring their king into the safe zone, where it is ultimately just being a very annoying piece to deal with and stopping our pawn from advancing further. But again, coming back to the starting position, we have a very clever idea of cutting the king off by playing rook e8, stopping the king from entering the fray, and they can attack our rook all they want, but ultimately we're going to keep our rook on the e file, cutting the king off in a bit of a different way to what we saw in the last example, where we did it horizontally, but this time we're doing it vertically, and pretty much from here we're just going to push our pawn up, probably use our king to support it, and there's not really much they could do in actually holding this position. I really do want to get more to talking about just pure rook endgames, not so much rook versus pawn stuff, but this is a sort of final, like, really important concept when it comes to rook versus pawn endgames I feel like you should really know about, which is that if you have this very specific scenario that we have on the board right now, where we have two connected passed pawns, and say it's white to move in this position, we go b6. Well, this is actually an interesting scenario where it's a well-known rule generally in these sorts of endgames where two connected passed pawns on the 6th rank is actually stronger than a rook, because there's simply just no way in these sorts of endgames that the rook on its own can handle the pawns like rampaging down and trying to promote. It can maybe grab one of the pawns, but it can't grab both. Like, I don't know if they just go rook h6 and try to skewer the pawns, well, we're going to push, and if they try to stop us, well, they're stopping that guy, but they're not stopping the other, right? And there we go, queen versus rook. Maybe not the easiest win the broad, I will admit, but nonetheless by objective standards this is still very good for white. And kind of showing this idea in action in a slightly more like complicated position, this is actually an over the board tournament game I had from when I was a bit younger. I had the black pieces, I was sort of getting kind of walked over, to be honest. I'm much worse, but I tried to trick my opponent by playing rook b3 in this position. Sacrificing the rook is not really a sacrifice, because if you take it, well, I'm going to go a2, force the rook to come back, and we see a similar tactical motif to the one we just witnessed, right, where these two pawns, not exactly both in the 6th rank, one is in the 7th rank already, but nonetheless you can clearly see in this position that black is winning. Which is why in the game my opponent just completely ignored my futile attempt at trying to draw the position and just played king d4, and now there are some serious issues black faces, because if I just like try to keep the tension there, they're going to take, go king c3, and if I go, say, b2, rook d1, I can't push this, and I also can't push this because take. And if I, say, tried to play instead of a takes b3, going to a2 first, again, this doesn't really work. White's going to pick up these pawns, nothing I can do. Which meant in the game I had to move my rook somewhere, but this position wasn't too promising. White had two passed pawns, they were also just a pawn up. In very short order, I went on to lose the game. But again, getting to more like pure rook endgames now, the position we have on the board is sort of illustrating a very important concept I want you guys to understand, which is in general like rook activity, right? But in particular, getting a rook onto the 7th rank is one of the most powerful things you can do in a rook endgame. If we really closely look at the position, we can evidently see that despite material being equal, white's position is much better, because this rook is a hell of a lot stronger than black's rook on b8, which is being passive defending this b7 pawn, while meanwhile our rook is not only attacking that pawn, but attacking this one, and just in general being a big pain in the ass to deal with. White's plan is very simple. We're probably going to like bring our king in and just try and like maybe use the f6 square to try and attack this pawn. And black, what is their plan? That's not so simple. Like, they would ideally like to say bring their king over, kick our rook off the 7th rank and force us to go backwards. But in this exact position, we can actually play rook c7 if they continue trying to march their king down, getting rid of our rook. Well, now they hang the f7 pawn, so their king is sort of shit out of luck here it can't do too many things at once. It can't kick our rook out while also defending the f7 pawn, which is actually why the evaluation of this position, if you were to plug it into a computer, it would be spitting all these crazy numbers at you. It would be telling you it's like +2, +3. And that may be confusing to some of you because you think this is an endgame, materials equal, what's the big deal? But the issue is everything. One, our king can become very active very quickly, black's cannot. Our rook is also very active, black's is not. But if we just change the position ever so slightly, such that compared to the last one, right, the pawn was on c6 and the rook was on b8, right, defending the pawn on b7. Now black is actually not doing too badly in this position at all, because if we try to bring our king in, well, now they can kick our rook off the 7th rank, and say after rook d2, notice how white just wasn't able to maintain their rook along that 7th rank in this position because of the exact configuration of black's pawn structure. Now black is actually sort of doing reasonably fine in this endgame. They can maybe even try and exchange rooks with something like rook d8 next. But the final example I'd like to really illustrate the power of the rooks in the 7th rank. In this case, we have 2 rooks on the board, and also not to mention white's upper pawn, but very often in rook endgames, what you have to understand, there's a saying, actually I forget who said it, but there was this one strong player who long ago said basically all rook endgames are draws, and he was basically referring to this tendency in rook endgames for even when one side is up a pawn, for there to still be a very strong chance that the game is actually going to result in a draw. So black definitely, you know, despite the fact they're down a pawn, right, definitely within the realms of potentially drawing this game. However, much of that went down the toilet on their next move when, you know, logically, right, they're like, okay, these rooks are very annoying, I want to try and trade one of them off. I can't move this rook because, you know, they're being a pain in the ass attacking all my pawns on the 7th rank, right? So what black tried was they tried to play this move rook b to c8. At least in this hypothetical example. I don't think this actually occurred in a game, I just sort of made this position up, but it illustrates the point I'm trying to make well. Which is this very typical tactical motif we see when there's 2 rooks on the board and one side has them both on the 7th rank, which is that when one side, usually the defensive one, that tries to initiate this sort of contact between the rooks, this is incredibly dangerous because white can actually grab a pawn now on f7, and we have this very strange phenomenon right now where both of the rooks are sort of making contact with each other, when it seems like surely black should be able to win some sort of material, right? But that's just not the case. If they take this rook, then we take this. We're 2 pawns up now, this is definitely winning, and if they take this rook, well, we're not going to take that one, of course, that would be losing. We come back to take this one, and again, 2 pawns up. This should be a fairly clinical win. This position, unlike the last one, however, is not made up. This actually occurred from one of my own blitz games, where technically speaking, white is winning in many different ways. We could just bring our king in maybe and support the promotion of the pawn like so. Should be fairly easy. But what I did in the game was slightly different in the sense that I used the d7 pawn to actually anchor our rook onto on the c8 square to sort of force through promotion. And this is a very typical idea. Also note that black can't really sneak their king in to stop promotion because, well, then we're going to get a discovered attack. Which is why my opponent, what they tried to do was, instead of bringing the king in first, they tried to blockade the pawn with their rook, but unfortunately doesn't address the idea, which is that we're going to play rook c8. I mean, there was nothing they could do, they were completely lost, but it illustrates the idea perfectly. Very often when you have a pawn on the 7th rank, a very nice way to simply force through the promotion is using this sort of pawn as an anchor to put your rook on, where of course if they take, you take back your queen now, and they can't really take this because of the sort of pin along the back rank. But this sort of pawn anchor concept does not only occur to when a pawn is maybe on the 7th rank per se, it can also occur much earlier on. This time unfortunately I was on the losing example. This was another blitz game I had where I in this position played h5, and probably a much simpler move would have been to play something like rook h5 defending the pawn like this. It looks slightly ugly to do so, but the problem with my move h5 that I played in the game was that I overlooked a very nice move from white, which was to once again anchor their rook onto the g5 square, where they're essentially forking the rook and pawn, of course, and if I take the rook, well, then f takes g5, and they're going to push their pawn up the board to g8, where it's going to queen, and there's simply nothing I can do about it, because my king isn't really in the square to reach it. And like, while technically I could move my rook away and prevent that from happening, I'm 2 pawns down in this position. It's not really what I wanted to happen. And so the position we have in front of us is another very important sort of concept when it comes to rook endgames, which is that in dealing with passed pawns, like for example the one that white has on the 7th rank right now, very far advanced, you can see there are a few different ways we can sort of go about dealing with such passed pawns. The first one, as we can see in this exact position, is to have our rook sort of in front of the pawn, stopping it in a very sort of brute force way. However, as we're going to see, like very often this is actually a very bad way of stopping sort of passed pawns. The second sort of way you can sort of do so is having the rook at the side, sort of trying to stop the pawn like that. And the final one is you can have the rook behind the pawn. Say instead of white's rook being on a1, let's pretend that our rook is on a1 and white's rook is on a8. That is usually what is considered to be the best sort of place to have your rook when dealing with a passed pawn. And it makes sense purely if we consider like the mobility the rook has when it's behind the pawn, whereas on like, you know, a8 it literally cannot move at all. Its only role is to just sit there like a good boy and wait until the day the white king comes over and slits its throat. And we can see precisely that happening in this position, right, where the white king just walks over and just takes a rook. If, you know, the king positions were reversed and the white king was on f3 and ours was on f5, it wouldn't be that bad because we'd walk over, come to the rescue, and then take the pawn. It would be a draw, but unfortunately in this position, that's not quite what is happening. But again, reversing the rook position such that, you know, our rook is on a1, white's rook is on a8, this is a slightly better situation because our rook has much more mobility. And say if the white king tries to walk over now, well, we have to be very careful to not let our king get checked by something like this, because the moment they give a check, their rook escapes the a8 square and they can promote. But of course, if we manage to escape out of those checks, well, then they can't move their rook because then we're just going to get a free pawn. And so in this position, black is almost drawing. I say almost because of a key detail, which is that, say in this position after king b6, usually what we would like to do is give a check. And then the moment they, you know, or if they go to the a file, we're going to continue giving checks. But the moment they go back to this file, we're going to go rook a1, and while it seems like our defensive mechanism is sort of holding up, it's not quite because of this one detail in the position where once the king gets to the c file, they can go rook c8, and now they therefore need to promote the pawn, and if we take it, well, they get this very nasty discovered check. They can go king b6, or the more swag king b8, that's also pretty cool, I guess, and then they win the rook. And again, this should be a pretty easily winning position for white. And again, even though this position was technically winning for white, I mean, just really notice, right, how much precise they had to be in using like all these very specific tactics in order to really make this position into a win. Just because, again, we had our rook behind the pawn where it was much more difficult for white to really generate any winning possibilities. But this position, while it looks very similar to the last one, is actually a draw. And it is mainly because our king is able to occupy what I'd call the safe corner, which is these squares g7 and h7, from which we can just shuffle between these squares, and there's just simply no way that white is able to make any progress. So pretty much if it were black to move in this position, which in this example it is, we're going to go king g7, and we are just going to vacate these squares for the rest of our life, and we're going to be very happy. But I don't just want to show you the correct move. Again, I want to explain to you why the other moves do not work. And again, we have to occupy the 7th rank, because if we go anywhere further, like to the 6th rank, well, then they can give us a check, and then they can promote, and unfortunately that isn't going to be very fun for us unless you like losing, right? Which I assume if you're watching this video, you don't. But some of you might sort of be asking, like, Sam, why are we going away from the pawn? Why are we not going towards the pawn to try and take the thing? Like, this looks so, like, natural, right? I mean, their king isn't going to be able to stop us, so, like, why don't we just go take the pawn, right? Well, I'm glad you asked that. But unfortunately, the issue in this position is that the rook is going to slide across to h8 now, and they're going to promote on the next move, so we're going to take, and it might seem like no problemo, but actually there is, because they give us a check and they skewer our rook now, and this position is of course again like a pretty simple win for the white pieces, which is precisely why our king comes to g7. And also note that if it were a white move, they would indeed be winning, because they would be able to play rook h8, and with the same tactic, after takes rook h7 check, they would be winning, which is why our king occupies this square, because now they cannot bring their rook around and give us that skewer, right? And they can bring their king in as far in as they want to protect the pawn. The moment they do so, however, we can't just move our king, because then they're going to move the rook out of the way, they're going to promote the next move, we can give them a check, but it doesn't really change anything. The moment we bring our rook back, they're going to promote. So the moment that their king sort of touch bases with the pawn on whatever square, whether it's h7 or a7, or like if black was the one promoting their pawn, like h2 or a2, that is the moment alarm bells should be going off on your head. You give them a check, they move away, and now you come back, attack the pawn. The moment they come back, you give them a check, and same story, right? Eventually they might go away to who knows where, the mom's, the dad's house, I don't know, and now they can't move their rook because, again, we're going to take the pawn. However, one thing which I'm not going to ask you to memorize this endgame, this is called the Vancouver position. This is a very interesting theoretical position, quite advanced as well. This is more so just for educational purposes of showing you this exists than like trying to get you to like really understand how to draw this position, because to be honest, even I kind of forgot about a lot of the details. But just to illustrate one cool difference between the pawn being on a6, which is Vancouver position, the other one we looked at, the name of which I can't quite remember, to be honest. Not sure if it has a name, probably does. But the problem in some sense is that you might be tempted to try and do the exact same thing we did in the last position, but it doesn't quite work the same, because in this position we might bring their king in all the way to the b7 square, for example. If we give a check, well, in the last position, the king sort of had to f off and go back to where it came from, right? But this time it can sort of hide on the a7 square, where you can see there are clearly no more checks, and what white can do is they can swing their rook around, harass our rook, and I don't know, like, say we go here, they harass us, we don't want to take, of course, so we move to the side, but then they just move their rook, and they're going to move their king out of the way, shove their pawn off the board. Not a damn thing we can do about that. Which is why the drawing method for the so-called Vancouver position is very different to the other one we looked at, and actually involves sort of the other method we haven't really looked at yet of defending against a passed pawn, which is not in front or from behind the pawn, but is actually rather defending beside the pawn, defending along this way. Again, if they ever push the pawn, then we get back to the position we're just looking at. The draw is actually quite complicated. I'm not going to go into more detail from here, but I just sort of want to instill these sort of possibilities into your guys' head, show you that these rook endgames, they're very rich, and there's a lot of these interesting possibilities that sort of lie within them. And before we sort of get to some final theoretical endgame positions of the video, I want to talk about a final more conceptual aspect of rook endgames, which is what I'd call the dead passed pawn. And what I mean by this is that very often in these sort of rook endgames, right, passed pawns can be very dangerous. But as we're going to see in this exact position, white takes on e5, and white is just 2 pawns up. We have 3 passed pawns on the queen side, but you might sort of be a little bit scared about these sorts of positions, because black is a very advanced passed pawn that is sort of looking ready to promote. But unfortunately, again, this is what I'd call a dead passed pawn, because it's dead, it can't go anywhere, because, okay, if the king maybe comes to d5 on d4, we can give a check, and then all of a sudden it's alive, and this is very bad for white, perhaps. Maybe it's still not that clear because we have 3 pawns, there's maybe a fighting chance, but of course, you know, this wasn't necessary by any stretch of the imagination, and in this position, white could probably go something like, instead of king d4, advance the king to a file where it cannot be checked, and like in this case, black is left to their own devices, just sort of wondering what went wrong in their life, since, you know, they can't move their pawn, they can't move their rook, because if they do, like, we're going to take their pawn, and so then, like, they can't even take this one because we're defending it, which means, like, they're just going to sit in their little cubby house for the rest of their life and wait for us to come over and slaughter them, a very unfortunate way for their life to end, but, you know, it is what it is. They had their run at things, but it just didn't quite work out. But rounding out the video now, I want to talk briefly about these sort of more theoretical endgame positions that a lot of people sort of rush into a lot of the times when they talk about rook endgames, and to be honest, aren't maybe as important as some people say they are. Like, they're important to know because you don't want to lose this sort of position. If you have the black pieces, that's sort of embarrassing. Your friends are going to make fun of you. You're not going to get invited back to the chess tournament. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration. But basically, you know, these are positions which most players should really know how to defend because they don't take much effort to learn, and once you learn them, you're going to be set for life. And the following position we have in front of us is called the Philidor position, where white usually has a pawn in the 5th rank, a king probably somewhere around there as well. And the most simple way for black to defend this position is just to play this move rook b6, sort of like cutting the king off as we were talking about earlier, right? This is called the 3rd rank defense, where now the king can no longer go to step on f6 or e6 or something like that. And if they push the pawn to now allow that, well, now the rook is going to sneak behind the pawn and give these annoying checks. There's no shelter that black can really hide behind. Compare this to if we say played something like rook b1 immediately. Like if we go to f6 now and give this check, well, notice how there's no pawn here, so it can sort of slide over to e6. And while we technically are still within the realms of drawing this position, it is a little bit more complicated. Whereas when we play rook b6, we force that guy up, or I mean they just wait, which isn't particularly fun, and then we slide behind and we just give them never-ending checks, or they go away and like F off and we take their pawn, that's also pretty fun. And the final idea or position we're going to be talking about today is the Lucena position, and in particular I want to sort of instill this idea into your mind of what I'd call, or at least what I'd learned growing up, called to be building the bridge, where essentially what you want to do as wide in this position is sort of shove your king out of the way, push the guy up, and, you know, promote to a queen buddy, right? But unfortunately what's going to happen here is they're going to give you a bunch of checks, and the checks just are not going to end. They're just going to keep checking you for the rest of your life, and you want to, like, I don't know, go on vacation or something and ditch this guy and promote him, right? But unfortunately, not going to quite happen because they're just going to take the pawn because you're left it unprotected, right? So, like, okay, we got to be a bit more sophisticated, obviously, in how we're going about promoting our pawn. We can't just, you know, like, move the king out of the way and get the sucker up. We have to have some sort of method for doing so, and this is where building the bridge comes in, where we're going to bring our rook to the 4th rank to start off with, and okay, let's say they play some sort of waiting move, like, I don't know, king d6. Well, now we're going to move the king out of the way, and if we compare to the other positions, okay, they can give us some checks, but it isn't really going to do much because this time we move our king to g6, they give us another check, fair enough, king to g5, and what we notice now is that if they give us another check, well, we can just simply block that. And this is the sort of bridge we've built, so to speak, by bringing our rook to the 4th rank, blocking this guy off, and if they take, well, their king is not within reach of our pawn, so they can move all they want, we promote, and of course if they avoid the trade, again, we're going to promote and this should be a fairly easy win. But anyways, that's all I have for today's video. If you guys enjoyed it, you know, please leave a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And also, of course, make sure to check out my stuff in the description below. I offer coaching for those who are interested. You can fill out a form. And there is also a free newsletter I have where I talk about these sort of chess improvement related topics, which if you're watching a video like this, I'm sure you are interested in, so that's free. Go check that out as well. But nonetheless, I hope you guys have a good day. I will see you until next time.